it's important to have open discussion and to hear each other. I very much discourage the thought police. There are uncomfortable topics. My opinions are my own, but let's go through them and make sure that we present the documentation or the evidence we have to support the concepts. I'm going to just work through some technical issues. Are we able to have the screen working, Noel? Okay, am I on the screen? Okay, all right. Okay, I see something different on my screen. Okay, so let's start with the first slide. Asian Pacific American. It's a term, and I'm going to go through this. It's not a term that we necessarily created as people from Japan, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, but it is a term that refers to us and that we have eventually embraced as a category. But to better understand that, let me start with the idea of who are you? Who am I? You are who you think you are, but what has created that idea? And who am I to other people? So let's start with the 11 p.m. ordinance. For those who don't know, there actually is a law in Philadelphia, started in 2005 until today. And that law basically is what we call neutral on its face. It simply says that for businesses where 50% of the food, the products, the services are consumed off premises, if they are on what's called a residential face block, which is a very vague definition, then they must close at 11 p.m. and they cannot open until 6 a.m. But that bill was created to target specifically Chinese takeout restaurants. And 97% in some cases of the businesses that were closed, not by licenses and inspection, but by the police under threat of arrest, were Chinese takeout restaurants. There were no regulations on how this was done. Someone would call the police would come out and close a restaurant, oftentimes ordering the people who were in the restaurant, even though they paid for food, to leave. And the penalty was $300 fine up to $2,000. 10 fines of $2,000 is $20,000. This occurred from 2005 to last year. And only because after a year of trying to amend that bill, finally, I told the mayor and city council that we would sue. And fortunately, Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund was able to get Pepper Hamilton, one of our top firms in Philadelphia, a big firm, a powerful firm, to, for free, pro bono, file a lawsuit in federal court, alleging the violation of the 5th and 14th Amendment. And there was a settlement whereby the city agreed to stop enforcing that law, train police, and also to compensate 23 plaintiffs. We could only come up with 23 plaintiffs, though there were many more, who received a total of $265,000. That was important. It was important that the city pay, and part of that is because the city never admitted that it did anything wrong. And to this day, it says the city has not seen any evidence that the ordinance was improperly enforced by police based upon the race or nationality of the restaurant owners. Next slide. The city passed a bill which it is enforcing today. That bill targeted Asian businesses particularly beer delis, unpopular businesses, to remove bulletproof glass. Many of these businesses are operating late at night. Many of them, even during the day, are areas that have high crime. And therefore, in the history of businesses, including African immigrant, Caribbean immigrant, and Asian American and Latino, there has been businesses that put up safety glass, plexiglass. But during the testimony, what was stated is that Asian American businesses sell drugs, sell illegal shots of liquor, exploit the community, and disrespect the customers. And therefore, the bill specifically targeted Asian American businesses. What the Asian American businesses said is that it will abide by any regulations, but the safety glass is a matter of protecting their lives, the lives of their workers, the lives of their customers. And if safety glass is removed, the alternative is the possibility of purchasing firearms. The vote was not close. The vote was 14-3. The mayor signed that bill into law on December 20th, 2017. The settlement of the bulletproof glass and the passing of the settlement of the 11 p.m. ordinance targeting Chinese takeout restaurants and the passing of the bulletproof glass raises the issue of discriminatory ordinances or laws that intelligent people, good people, say are not discriminatory. Let's go to the next slide. One of the issues that was in the press was an allegation that Harvard University and other elite universities discriminate against Asian Pacific Americans in the admission process. Part of that was based on statistical evidence and other evidence that when Asian Pacific Americans apply to Harvard, in this case, that there are several criteria that are considered beyond GPA, beyond SAT or ACT scores, things like athletics, diversity, leadership, those type of things. But what also came of it is that even in certain circumstances, even white applicants were allowed lower entrance scores. For example, the average SAT score was 1380, but in areas called sparse country, white applicant scores could be lowered to 1310. And anywhere in the United States, other minority scores could be as low as 1100. But they were never lowered in any areas for Asian Pacific Americans. Even in areas where they were lowered to 1310 for white male applicants, Asian Pacific Americans still had to bring in a score of 1380. There was also evidence that in very subjective areas, such as ratings for integrity, helpfulness, courage, kindness, fortitude, empathy, self-confidence, leadership ability, maturity, and grit, that Asian Americans scored on average lowest among any group that applied to Harvard University. This raises issues, and the issue is not that diversity is not important, nor is it one that affirmative action is not important. It's simply that diversity cannot be constructed on discrimination. Next slide. So when we look into this issue, we can see in 2018, New York City Mayor de Blasio announced his plan to eliminate New York City high school admission tests for elite schools. If you look at the graph on your lower right, you could look at the total number of students based on the category of Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian for all other high schools. But in elite schools, specialized schools, Black was 4%, Hispanic was 6%, white was 24%, Asian Pacific American 62%. And so Mayor de Blasio announced that he would come up with simply 7% of students from each public middle school, which would then leave the white students at 24%, reduce Asian students from 62% to 31%, increase African American students to 19%, and Latino students to 27%. Is it a good goal to improve diversity? Yes. However, is it a problem that there's no objective criteria other than a quota or a classification? Does that improve education in the neighborhoods and communities? And if you have not improved education, what is really the problem? If you haven't solved or improved education, what you have done is rearrange the numbers. And so the issue becomes, is it really that 62% of the students in magnet schools are Asian Pacific American? And if you simply reduce that number, people are happy. Let's go to the next slide. So much is made of the fact that if you look at the slide on your left, that public high school graduation rates in America show that Asian Pacific Americans graduate at 92%, white Americans at 89%, African Americans at 79%, Hispanic Americans at 81%. Then when you go to college, Asian Americans are graduating college at 50%, white Americans at 45%, African Americans at 21%, Hispanic Americans at 32%. So that would indicate what? That Asian Pacific Americans do better in high school and college. At least there are the graduation rates. But let's go to the next slide. What are Asian Pacific Americans? So when we look at this Pew Research Center, they looked at Chinese, Filipinos, Indian, Vietnamese, Japanese. You will find that there's no Cambodians, there's no Malaysians, there's no Indonesians, there's no people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iraq, Iran. In other words, what are Asian Pacific Americans? It's not a unified group. And I'm going to go into what it is, but it's basically a leftover group. It's a collection of a lot of people that have nothing in common with each other than they've been lumped into a group called Asian Pacific Americans. But if you look at the first graph of foreign born, 76% of Chinese Americans are foreign born, 69% of Filipinos, 87% of Indians, 84% of Vietnamese. You could see that basically there are a lot of foreign born. And that's because the immigration laws in the United States prohibited Asian Americans from coming to this country, naturalizing, and if they couldn't naturalize, there were many restrictions on things like owning property. Obviously, voting was something they could not do. But when you look at college degree, for example, 51% of Chinese have a college degree. Their median household income, you could see at 65. When you look at Koreans, for example, 53% have a college degree. Their median household income is 50,000. Look at Vietnamese, 26% have a college degree, but their median household income is higher than Koreans. So the issue is, one, is there a group of people called Asian Pacific Americans that have something in common with each other? Secondly, does high school graduation and college reflect success in America? Let's go to the next slide. Bamboo ceiling. So there are studies that have come out that despite Asian Pacific Americans graduating well in school, having higher degrees in education, graduating from Ivy League school, they are employed, but least likely to be promoted. A report reported in the Harvard Business Review, the illusion of Asian success. Asian Americans are least likely racial group to be promoted into leadership ranks, even in Silicon Valley, where they are most likely among all groups to be hired in tech jobs. Let's go to the next slide. What all this goes to is the idea of model minority myth. What is the model minority myth? Well, let's start with this, model minority. That term has been used for numerous groups because we're a country that has many ethnic groups, many of whom have come over through immigration, whether it's Irish, Polish, Italian, Jewish. And so the idea of model minority, which used by the mainstream, is a term of praise for a minority group. But that term has been used for Asian Pacific Americans. But more specifically, there was no such group called Asian Pacific Americans. That term was used for Japanese Americans. And in those days, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipino Americans did not see themselves as one group of people. And we'll go into history of why that term was used. But the term model minority myth states that the perception that people who are identified as Asian Pacific Americans, that perception of success is false, and secondly, harmful, because it overlooks the needs and problems of Asian Pacific Americans. Later, it emphasized model minority myth as pitting Asian Pacific Americans against other minority groups. By praising Asian Pacific Americans, it is discrediting other other minority groups. Currently, model minority myth promotes a false narrative that Asian Pacific Americans have obtained a level of success because the white power structure favors Asian Pacific Americans who are docile and politically inactive over other minorities. The false narrative states that Asian Pacific Americans come from privilege, lack courage, don't contribute to the public good unless there's personal gain, don't stand up for higher values, didn't fight discrimination, but rush to enjoy the benefits, thereby depriving those who truly earned them. This false narrative has been used to justify unconstitutional discrimination against Asian Pacific Americans. Next slide. So let's start with the idea that Asian Americans just got here. Well, Asian Americans have been here for quite a long time. 1587, 1763, 1781, and through the 1780 to 1844. Next slide. In fact, the first recording of Asian Americans serving in the military was during the War of 1812, when Andrew Jackson recorded that Manila men, obviously from the Philippines, fought under his general command. Next slide. So when did discrimination against Asians begin? Next slide. Well, let's go to the next slide. Well, when Asians started coming here in greater numbers, and that was because in China, in the later part of the 1800s, in a 13-year period around 1850 to 1851 to 1864, 20 million Chinese were killed. And as a result, Chinese signed up as laborers and left China. Many of them arrived in the United States for the gold rush, ended up working on the railroads. Then we have other immigration of Asians coming to the United States after 1850 to 1920. Go to the next slide. So as Asians start arriving, and specifically Chinese, the California Gold Rush, Transcontinental Railroad. In 1790, the Naturalization Act stated that free white persons of good moral character could naturalize. Not every white person could naturalize, and certainly no one else could naturalize. And there were other laws targeting immigrants, and in particular, people of Asian heritage and specifically Chinese. Next slide. In the meantime, there was a civil war, and on your lower left is Corporal Joseph Pierce. That's his chosen name. Asian Americans fought in the Civil War. You can see some of the countries that were represented, India, China, Thailand, the Philippines. They were serving in both the Union and Confederate side of the Civil War. It was a war about this country, about the Confederacy versus the Union. It was about slavery and whether there could be slavery. It was about the slaves who were of African heritage. It was not about Chinese or Asians. Next slide. During the time that Asians were coming to the United States, numerous acts of exclusion were passed, the most famous of which is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which did not allow the Chinese to come to this country as immigrants. Next slide. And during that time, violence begins. So there was violence on small scale, particularly, for example, murder of Chinese who had successfully found gold, that type of thing. But in 1871, there was a massacre in Los Angeles, and the Chinese were in Los Angeles because they fled the violence that was in California and in the West after the railroads, and they centered in Los Angeles and other cities. A mob of 500 rioters dragged and lynched 18 Chinese. Next slide. Denver riot, Rock Springs massacre, Snake River massacre were recorded, and basically in none of these cases was anyone convicted of murder. Partly because under the laws, a person of Asian heritage could not testify against a white person. Cultural discrimination, such as not being able to carry baskets in a traditional Chinese manner, having braids, the hair, the queue, being cut to 1 inch if you were in prison. And that in particular, Ho Ah Cow versus Noonan. Noonan was a sheriff. What happened is, because there were a lot of Chinese in the poor section of San Francisco, they made a law which, as you could see, California cubic air law. That means a person, for sanitary and health reasons, had to have 500 cubic feet of space between them and the next person living with them. That was only applied to the Chinese. And the Chinese protested by not paying the fine. As a result, they filled up San Francisco's jail, and the sheriff began cutting off their braid to humiliate them. Ho Ah Cow went to the Supreme Court and actually won. It was found that that law was based on discrimination and therefore a violation of the 14th Amendment. In 1880, famously, Yik Wo also went to the Supreme Court and won because the law, neutral on its face about Chinese, basically about laundries, but targeting Chinese-owned laundries based on the fact that you need to get a permit, which they couldn't get, and their buildings were made of wood, that a law neutral on its face, like the 11 p.m. ordinance, but discriminatory in its enforcement, was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Yik Wo would be used 150 times in the civil rights movement in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Next slide. That's Asians fighting discrimination in the courts of law. Why? Because they didn't have a vote, they weren't popular, they couldn't get legislation passed, the only place they could go was the courts. The idea that Asian Americans did not fight for civil rights is absolutely false. Ho Ah Kao, as I mentioned, In Ray Chong, they stated that you had to be an elector in California to be able to fish. Well, obviously, Chinese could not be citizens. They couldn't vote, so they couldn't be elector. Ah Chong went to the California Supreme Court. He went beyond that, and that was a violation. As I said, Yik Wo, a neutral law, for example, the bulletproof glass law, targeting just a specific group of people is discriminatory. Next slide. And Tate versus Harley, there was a law in San Francisco that required children to go to school, but the Chinese schools were closed, underfunded, they sparsely operated, and if you didn't send your child to school, there were fines and penalties, punishments. So in the Tate case, the daughter Mamie went to an all-white school. She was kicked out of the school. They brought a lawsuit and they won, that San Francisco must provide public education to Mamie. However, the superintendent of San Francisco schools lobbied the legislature to fund a separate Chinese school, and that basically was the beginning of separate but equal. In 1927, predating Brown v. Board of Education, Lum versus Wright, the Supreme Court found that the state could discriminate against a non-white person, in this case, a Chinese girl, by saying that she could not attend public school. Next slide. Next slide, yes. And in United States versus Wong Kim Ark, Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to non-US citizens. Obviously, his parents could not be citizens. They were Chinese. And at 21, he went to China to visit his parents. And when he came back, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they denied him entry. He went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that under the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause, that any child born in America to non-citizen parents were US citizens by birth. And that historic case established birthright citizenship in the United States. Next slide. There was a national movement to eliminate Chinese restaurants from the United States. So the 11 p.m. ordinance turns out to be nothing new. When you look at this national movement, boycott, that was from the AFL, which predates the FL-CIO. For example, here in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, City Council passed a law. Fortunately, the mayor in Pittsburgh vetoed it in 1910. Chinese restaurants had to close earlier than any other restaurant, and women could not work or dine in a Chinese restaurant. Why is that? Because people enjoyed Chinese food. It was tasty, it was less expensive, but when they closed earlier, in addition, women could not eat or work. A family of four, mother, father, son, and daughter, could not dine in a Chinese restaurant. And there were many women who needed work and they could not work in a Chinese restaurant. Beer and noodles in Chinese joints have caused the downfall of countless American girls. It's immoral. There was wrong corruption in a Chinese restaurant. Next slide. Next slide. At the same time, 1898, Manifest Destiny, there is the Spanish-American War. The US ends up with the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. 11 years later, American Samoa, and in 1893, Hawaii. Next slide. Part of this period of time, which is a colonial period of time in Americans' history, the Philippines there, the US Army establishes the Philippine Scouts, 1901. It is part of the US Army. And you could see that the first Asian Pacific American to receive the Medal of Honor, Private Jose Nisperos, received it in 1911. That is important because the Philippine Scouts will come up later in this discussion. But 500 Filipinos were allowed to enlist in the US Navy. Next slide. World War I, next slide. Asian Americans served in World War I. More than 5,700 Filipinos and thousands of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipinos served on the ground forces. Here are some of them. I'll take note of Sergeant Major Takutaro Slocum, who served with the 82nd Division in World War I, served with distinction. Next slide. So the veterans of World War I were basically promised citizenship, naturalization. And so this gentleman, Ozawa, he applied for citizenship he basically applied because the only people who could apply for citizenship, naturalization, were white or of African heritage. He said he was white. If you look at him, his skin is whiter than most white people, he said, or the average white person. The Supreme Court issued a decision denying eligibility of naturalization of citizenship to first-generation Japanese Americans. Asians are not white. Next slide. That was 1922. 1925, Toyota, who served in World War I for 7 years, was granted naturalization. That naturalization was rescinded, and the Supreme Court ruled specifically a person of Japanese race may not be naturalized regardless of war service. The 1918 Veterans Naturalization Act only applied to Filipinos. Next slide. Bhagat Singh Thind was a Sikh. He's the first person in history to be authorized to wear a turban for religious reasons. He joined the military in 1918, stationed at Fort Lewis, and he was granted citizenship. It was rescinded. He appealed and basically said that, yes, he's Aryan and therefore white. The Supreme Court stated that this isn't like a technical thing, being white. It's more like a common sense thing. And therefore, you have to be like the common sense word white, like European white. He did apply 3 times and eventually was able to become a citizen. Part of that was probably because of the Leah Act. Let's go to the next slide. Our friend Sergeant Major Takutaro Slocum lobbied for the passage of a law, the Leah Act, which allowed 400 Japanese immigrant veterans of World War I to be able to become citizens, and 100 other Asian veterans to naturalize. Within 10 years, he and his family were forcibly relocated to Manzanar because of the executive order for Japanese Americans. Next slide. In the meantime, a Korean American, Dr. Philip Jason, actually right around Philadelphia, was lobbying along with Korean leaders the League of Nations to recognize the independence of Korea from Japanese rule. And they lobbied here in Philadelphia, declared the independence of Korea. There was a famous march, but the League of Nations chose to support Ireland and not Korea. Next slide. Next slide. Images of Asian Americans. Okay, so let's go. Yes, Asian Americans. So while this is going on, there's a very negative view of who Asian Americans are. And quite frankly, there are not very many Asian Americans. A lot of hatred for a group of people that very few people run into. Many people never met an Asian person. So it's surprising that there were people like Anna Mae Wong and Sasui Hayakawa. Surprising because they were both top-level movie stars. They had their issues, but I would say movie stars have issues. Anna Mae Wong was a top-level movie star and fashion icon, extremely popular, went to Europe, all kind of things. But later, she was passed over for the role of Olin in The Good Earth. And again, what happened is non-Asian Pacific American actors were given the role to play. Sasui Hayakawa was a heartthrob. He was extremely popular with the women as a romantic type of lead. However, he was typecast as a villain, and later played the role of Colonel Saito in Bridge Over River Kwai. Next slide. And not surprisingly, there's Dr. Fu Manchu. For those who don't know, he doesn't have a Fu Manchu, he is Fu Manchu. That's where the term for the mustache comes. Flash Gordon would fight the Ming the Merciless, who was trying to take over the planet Earth. And Ming the Merciless had a daughter, Princess Aura, who was, the kind of sexualized villainess who loved the all-American Flash Gordon. None of these characters that are supposed to be Asian American were played by, obviously, Asian actors. Next slide. Edith Eaton, half Chinese. Her mother actually rescued from basically a pretty harsh life in a circus where she, among other things, would have knives thrown at her. And her father, she became a journalist, a writer, and she used the pen name Sui Sin Far. And she wrote about working class Chinese in white America. Again, another image presented to Americans at that time. Next slide. And Young Wing, a scholar who came to the United States, he wasn't wealthy. He was a bright student, eventually went to to Yale, and established a program of bringing 120 Chinese, actually for 15 years of study in the US, and later married and resided in Hartford, Connecticut. He donated 1,200 volumes to Yale, which is the backbone of their China and Asia department. And he was publicized, and his image, of course, impressed Americans here. So let's move to the next slide. Donaldina Cameron, a woman who saved between 1,500 and 3,000 Chinese women and girls from a life of prostitution. One of the problems with the Exclusion Act is with all the violence and laws against the Chinese, they were all men. They could not bring women over. There was no job opportunities, hence the restaurants, the laundries. They were really limited because of their hard work, that type of thing. They weren't able to go back to China. They could not come back in. So crime arose, and crime was understood by basically the local government. But as long as it was in Chinatown, and one of the things that occurred was prostitution and the bringing over of young girls. This also became publicized, the victimization of girls and women by Chinese men, and added to the imagery of Asians in America. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time, in 1928, 14 Japanese American young ladies in college who were rejected from the sorority made their own, Chi Alpha Delta. And it's important because these young women wanted to be young women. They wanted to be like everybody else, enjoy, have an education. And it was the Americanization, but they had to establish their own sorority. And again, this confronts and rejects the idea that Asian Americans didn't fight for civil rights, didn't serve the country, got here after everything was done, and were docile. Next slide. The golden age of Chinatown nightclubs. So while this is going on, 1930s, which is really around the Depression, going even up to the 1960s, the nightclub Forbidden City and many nightclubs in San Francisco, which were basically like the Cotton Club, Asian entertainers, singers, dancers, burlesque, were extremely popular with people like Humphrey Bogart, major actors, and the military coming through to enjoy dinner, dancing, and the shows. And so the image of Asian Americans, you could see, is being presented to a population of Americans that really don't come into much contact with them. What is consistent about that image? Next slide. Pearl S. Buck grew up in China, had great, she came to the United States and was appalled by the discrimination towards the Chinese. She wrote The Good Earth, Pulitzer Prize, Nobel winner. It became a movie. At the same time, she was very concerned about the children and about Amerasian children and the fact that they were not worthy of adoption. She did a lot of things for adopting children in Asia and really advocated the idea of humanity for Asian and Asian Americans. Next slide. The Great Depression, Asian American, are you able to benefit from any of the programs during the New Deal? No. Next slide. World War II breaks out. 1942, President Roosevelt orders a relocation or the internment or the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans because they're Japanese Americans, 80,000 of whom were US citizens. And so the Japanese Americans lost their property, lost their homes. They were put into basically internment camps, and they did fight. There are the cases. The most notable is Korematsu, where the Supreme Court ruled that the internment of US citizens of Japanese ancestry was not a violation of the Constitution. Strikingly, Justice Murphy wrote, Justice Jackson, the standard, that means there has to be a reasonable basis for this, preventing invasion, espionage, sabotage, was not there. There's no evidence proving that people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast were a threat to the safety of the United States. Instead, the decision to force them into internment camps was based on, quote, an accumulation of much of the misinformation, half-truths, and insinuations that had long been the source of racial prejudice against Japanese Americans. Next slide. What happens is there are Japanese Americans who are in Hawaii, the 100th Battalion, and later through lobbying of the Japanese American Citizens League, Japanese Americans who are in these incarceration camps are allowed to form a military unit. They do, and what is created is the 442 Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated military unit of its size and lengths of service in the history of America. That's a unit of about 4,000 soldiers. They got 18,000 awards in 2 years, 21 Medal of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Cross, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, an incredible 9,486 Purple Hearts. They went through about 14,000 soldiers in their units because of death and casualties. Most famously, they were called upon to rescue soldiers that were trapped behind enemy lines from Texas, and the battle-weary 442 went in with heavy casualties and were able to rescue them. It was well publicized, highly publicized. One of the lieutenants of that unit was a Korean American, later very well known Colonel Young Kim, who founded many social service organizations in California, primarily through his connection to the Japanese Americans. He was, they tried to remove him from the Japanese American unit because he was Korean American and the occupation of Korea. And his answer was, we're all Americans fighting for the same cause. Next slide. By the way, there's a national Go for Broke Day. Filipino, Chinese American troops, highly decorated, again, much service to this country. Next slide. Asian American women, more than did their share. And on the far right, you see Hazel Ying Lee, who actually volunteered to go to war in China and then joined the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. She was a leader among them. And then due to tower confusion, her plane collided. 2 days later, she died of her burns. 3 days later, her family learned of the death of her brother, who was serving in a tank corps in Europe, in France. And the cemetery where they wanted both of them buried, it was a white section. They did not allow the brother and sister to be buried there. The family insisted and ultimately prevailed. Next slide. Here are some of the Asian Americans that served, thousands of them. For example, the first World War I ace, Arthur Chin, Medal of Honor recipient, Captain Y, Korean American, World War II flying ace, Fred Orr, later Senator and President pro tempore, Daniel Inouye, Medal of Honor recipient, and of course, Colonel Kim. Next slide. The guy in the middle, this is two brothers and a sister. That's Philip An, who later is known for being Master Khan in the TV series Kung Fu. Next slide. The First Lady of Physics, she was on the Manhattan Project, and her Wu experiment led to 2 other Chinese Americans receiving the Nobel Prize in Physics. Next slide. And because China was an ally, in 1943, the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, but only allowed 105 Chinese per year. Next slide. Post-World War II. Next slide. Japanese Americans. So Japanese Americans, their service, their heroism, those veterans came back and fought against all these discriminatory laws against Japanese Americans. And you could see going into 1976, going past, they were able to do that because they also gained political power, advocacy, and they had the support of their service and the respect of the American public. Next slide. The Cold War occurs, and you'll find that APA history is very much tied to war. So right after World War II, there's communism, there's the Cold War, the Red Scare. Who is a threat to America? Well, China. Next slide. And that occurs in a little place that Americans never heard of called Korea. Tremendous casualties. And then as America's pushing north, China comes in, they go to an armistice, and that is a threat to America. But there's also the fact that Koreans begin to immigrate over, Amerasian adoptees, Korean brides of US military. And because of the Korean War later, 320,000 Korean soldiers served in support of America in Vietnam, which later leads to immigration. During this time in 58, In Ho O's, actually my cousin, was murdered mailing a letter. You can see on the right-hand side, Mayor Dilworth, money raised, and then that bottom photograph in the middle is Marian Anderson, civil rights leader, opera singer, who came out to support the Korean American community. Next slide. A letter of forgiveness, raising money for the boys who murdered their son. It was very well reported, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, all but forgotten now. Next slide. Again, after World War II and what you saw, the actual service of Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipinos, still we go back to a time of imagery to the public. From Hop Sing, who is the cook for Bonanza, Susie Wong, the kind-hearted prostitute, and of course, martial arts. Next slide. But in 1957, the first non-white congressman, an Indian American, is elected. He has health problems, cannot run for re-election really. Daniel Inouye is elected US Senator, becomes Senate President pro tempore. Patsy Mink in 1965, the first woman of color to Congress, and Norm Mineta in 75, later becomes the first cabinet member. Next slide. 65 is the Immigration Naturalization Act, which opens up immigration to Asia. And now Asians start arriving. They had not been, they really came after 68 because of the quota. Next slide. And you could see the timeline. Next slide. And you could see that this group called Asian Pacific Americans, well, that's not a group they identified. Look at the graph on the right. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Thailand. This is not a cohesive group of people. Unlike white Americans who came from Europe, but in many generations are speaking English and are well entrenched into political power, culture, other things, and African Americans who were brought here as slaves speak English and have a common history. Next slide. What they missed was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They're coming after 68. And so Asian American groups like the JACL, Asian Americans for Action, they're involved in civil rights, but most Asian Americans, as you saw from the other graph, were coming, they are foreign born. They came after 68. Next slide. The activist court really took the Civil Rights Act and aggressively struck down discriminatory laws. They did so by also creating quotas to not only fight discrimination, but to address it. And they created protected classes, presumptions, and those protected classes created a category, which was the presumption. If you are being discriminated against and you can show discrimination, the burden shifts. And then the employer or someone else has to present evidence. The categories are white, black, and other. There's no Latino, there's no Asian. Next slide, and next slide, post 65. So the Vietnam War, part of the Cold War, Vietnam is there as part of the Cold War, but in 67, there are anti-war protests, the draft, the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese attack the US. It's shocking to the US. Nixon gets elected, basically saying he'll bring an honorable end to the war by withdrawing with honor. Asian Americans arriving after this time are not knowledgeable about any of these things, including the fact that there are categories, that there were civil rights struggles and things like that. Next slide. So Loving Virginia is a case where there's law in Virginia that you can't intermarry someone of another race. That has been applied to Asians this entire time. And Judge Moritani, who was on the far right became a judge here in Philadelphia. Next slide. Chinatowns, which were undesirable areas of, poverty and crime, where crime was almost allowed and there was a lack of economic opportunity, are now surrounded by other properties, and gentrification arrives in Chinatown. Far beyond what people talk about gentrification today, the gentrification of Chinatowns have been going on for a long time. Here in Philadelphia, they ran the Vine Street Expressway right through the middle of Chinatown, and Chinatown fought back. Next slide. Vincent Chen, basically a US citizen. He was in a bar celebrating a bachelor party. Two men came up to him, white men, and said, "Because of you Japanese, we're unemployed." They attacked him. He ran out in the parking lot. They followed him out there, attacked him some more. He ran away. They got their baseball bats, ran down the street, beat him to death in front of McDonald's, and numerous witnesses. The judge said they were good men and basically gave them extremely light sentence. Notably, the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild declined to help the family of Vincent Chen because they said they didn't see any violation of civil rights. Fortunately, the US Department of Justice got involved. Next slide. Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. Next slide. And now those same Japanese Americans who served in World War II, got elected, attacked, were able to overcome all those discriminatory laws, end up in 1988 passing the Civil Liberties Act, which was reparations to those who were in the internment camps or in incarceration reparations, something like $1.2 billion at the time, just a very large sum of money. Important again because of what it represents. Next slide. Asian Americans who arrived after 68 didn't know that the poor areas of the city, they couldn't go to rich areas of the city or the suburbs. They opened stores in poor areas. Those areas had been, there had been riots, there had been other things. The store owners had left. Those stores were available, a lot of them in poor African American sections. They didn't know the culture, they didn't know the language, the people there didn't know them. There was violence, resentment, and rumors of sorts, such as immigrant Asians received money from the federal government if they would open a store in a Black neighborhood to weaponize these Asian immigrants against African Americans as a way of preventing African Americans from having upward mobility. And so they did not know that this was the information that was out there. Next slide. And of course, one of the major things that happened while all this tension and racial animosity is going on is the LA riots, really because 4 white police officers were acquitted of the beating of Rodney King. Rioting broke out and the police blocked the access to LA and sent them into Koreatown. At the same time, there was the murder of Latasha Harlins, a 15-year-old girl who was wrongly accused by the Korean store owner of trying to rob her. And the Korean store owner, after a scuffle, as Latasha is leaving the store, shoots her in the back of the head and kills her. And so racial tensions and practices of the police block the area of K-Town, Koreatown, and there's rioting, looting, burning, and violence. Next slide. Next slide. Islamophobia, and then I'm going to have to wrap up. 9/11. I remember when 9/11 occurred, people thought it was China attacking the US because who else had the sophistication to have that kind of attack? But it turned out to be Middle East. and the response was anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim violence, targeting, and for people who didn't know, as many Americans did not know, the largest group of Muslims in the world is Asian. Next slide. South Philly High, the principal blames the students for getting beat up and hospitalized, and the superintendent supports them. Next slide. Home invasion robberies in 2016, again, targeting of Asian American store owners, not the first time. But from that, we learned that there's a thing called 11 p.m. ordinance. We did not know that until the hearings about the robberies targeting Chinese takeout restaurant owners. Next slide. And it continues with a man walking down the street with an AK-47. He attacks a Asian American beer deli owner who's got a hose, and the beer deli owner sprays him with the hose. The guy, they struggle over the AK-47. The man is shot in the hip and loses his store. He's got a permanent disability and pain. But the district attorney's office said that since the two of them were struggling over the rifle, that it was not something they were going to charge aggressively. Next slide. So let me wrap up this way. Know your history, know your rights, for your sake and for every other person's sake. Do not tolerate discrimination, not against other people and not against Asian Americans. Educate yourself about Asian Pacific American history. Educate yourself about other people's history as well. I say, don't dance to someone else's music. March to the beat of your own drum. Thank you very much.